Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know, from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars, topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
To the GSMC Basketball Podcast. I am your host, Michael Schroeder, and this podcast is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Thank you again for tuning into the show. A lot of great stuff to unpack from this week in the NBA, and this is going to be a really exciting show to break down a lot of different stuff. We're going to talk about the Sixers overcoming the Brooklyn Nets and the Los Angeles Clippers this week, as well as break down the whole drama behind the play-in tournament in the NBA. And I'm going to also break down a little bit more about why the Atlanta Hawks have been so successful recently, getting up to fourth place in the East. And then later on the show, I'm going to talk about the whole reason why I don't think super teams are helping the NBA and why I think it was bad that they existed in the first place. While they make sense because of the way the league has gone in terms of building super teams, I don't think they should have ever been built. So all that stuff's going to be broken down on this show. To start off with, though, the Philadelphia 76ers have proven a lot this season. They've proven that they are a contending team in the NBA for sure. Doc Rivers has really turned this team around. Joel Embiid is playing the best basketball of his career. And rightfully so, people are sitting there and saying, the Brooklyn Nets are too talented, no one can beat them. But I would beg to differ on that. And I'm going to break down the Philadelphia 76ers against the Brooklyn Nets and the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, mind you, the Brooklyn Nets were shorthanded against Philadelphia, and the Clippers were shorthanded against Philadelphia. But I'm going to break down exactly why I think Philly could legitimately get out of the Eastern Conference by breaking down these two games for you guys, giving you my key takeaways, and just explaining why Philadelphia is indeed a contending team. In terms of the Nets game, right, everyone saw they had a 123-117 victory over the Nets. They blew a 20-point lead with 8:30 to go. The bench guys in the Nets came in and made a real impact. If you look at the plus-minus, Kyrie Irving was minus 13 when he was on the court, even though he had 37 points. And the reason why they kept the bench guys, according to Steve Nash, is he wanted to reward the guys, which, again, seems a little interesting why you wouldn't put Kyrie Irving back in the game. But the big thing is that Joel Embiid dominated. He had 39 and 13. No one had an answer for him. Tobias Harris had 26 points, but went out with a little bit of a knee injury, right, which caused him not to play against the Los Angeles Clippers on Friday. I'm recording this on Saturday, so it was last night when they played against the Los Angeles Clippers. And the Nets actually, ironically, won the rebounding battle and the bench scoring. They won by 11 in the rebounding battle because they just played harder in the last couple minutes of the game, got every loose ball. And I know basketball doesn't always come down to who plays harder. Like, that's not always a great way to define it, but in this case it did, because the bench guys came in and completely played with more urgency than the Philly guys did, which caused Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons to have to come back in the game and actually have to close this game out. And the reason why I say the shorthanded Nets is the Nets really only had Joe Harris and Kyrie Irving, right, and Jeff Green. They didn't have Kevin Durant. They didn't have James Harden. James Harden is out with a hamstring injury, looking to return soon, and Kevin Durant was out because of load management. And here are some takeaways I take from that game, right? I think that what I kind of took away is that Brooklyn does not really care about the regular season, and I think that's going to hurt them at the end. I'm not as high on Brooklyn as everyone else is. I acknowledge that they are definitely the most talented team in basketball, and that when two of the stars are playing together, they look really good. But you have guys like, you have Kyrie taking days off. You have Kevin Durant deciding to load manage. And then you have James Harden has been injured at this point, right? Blake Griffin's been load managing left and right. And unfortunately, I'm really happy that LaMarcus Aldridge is going to take care of his health and stay with his family. But it's very unfortunate that he had an irregular heartbeat that caused him to have to retire. And it's just one thing after another, right? There's a little bit of too much noise around the Brooklyn Nets. And the fact is, when you go into a game like that, if you're Steve Nash, you shouldn't be playing, if you're going to load manage Kevin Durant during the week, you should load manage him against the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are the worst team in the NBA, versus load managing him against the team in the Philadelphia 76ers that you guys are basically in almost a tie with at that point. I think it was like half a game separated them. Now it's one game for the number one seed in the East. Now Philly's going to most likely get the number one seed in the East. And I understand that people are going to say, well, Brooklyn is going to be fine in the playoffs. Well, we'll see, right? I think they're going to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. And I think that, look, they could definitely win a championship because they have the talent to do so. But you only played 7 games as a big three. And the fact that you're not taking the regular season very seriously, we saw this story before the Los Angeles Clippers, who obviously are not nearly as talented as the Brooklyn Nets, but not caring about the regular season is a big issue. And the second point I want to make is that Philly can definitely win the East. They can definitely win the East because Joel Embiid's very dominant. They have the number 2 ranked defense in the NBA. And Tobias Harris is a really legitimate second scorer. And Ben Simmons does a lot of stuff to help you win. And if the role players step up, they could really get over the hump because they have role players that can explode and do a lot of different things. Their big problem is urgency at closing out games. And they should have blown out Brooklyn. It should not have came to a 6-point game. That was urgency, right? They've done that against the Lakers this year too, where they were up by 15. The Lakers came back and almost won the game. And the good news is, even when they blow these leads, they're able to still win the game. But you can't bank on that in the playoffs. They have to have a little bit more urgency. And I think from a defensive standpoint, from a toughness standpoint, they can definitely win the East. But they just need to be a little bit better with their urgency at closing out games. My third point is that basically with this game is Embiid and Harris are dominant and their presence makes things very difficult. Especially against Brooklyn, who's not a very big team and doesn't have much of an interior presence. Joel Embiid took full advantage of that. He had 39 and 13. Tobias Harris had 26 points. And you watch that game, the Brooklyn Nets had no answer for either of those guys. And Brooklyn just doesn't play any defense to start with, but that's also because their interior defense is very poor. They also had Joe Harris guarding Tobias Harris, which is a huge mismatch. Joe Harris is about 6'5". Tobias Harris is 6'8". And Tobias Harris is big. He's very skilled. His game is very similar to Carmelo Anthony's, actually. If you watch it closely, Tobias Harris is like kind of a poor man's Carmelo Anthony, in a sense. And that's actually a compliment more than it might seem that in that sense. But Tobias Harris is really, really good. He should have been an all-star this year. Surprised he wasn't. But the fact is that Brooklyn can't guard those two guys. And if Ben Simmons can get you 15 points in the playoffs, you're in good shape because Ben Simmons does a lot of other things really well for your team to win. And that's going to segue also the fact that the Sixers are big, they're athletic, but all of them can defend. And that's going to really help them out too. The fourth point is something I kind of touched on in that other point I just made about Tobias and Embiid, is that Brooklyn doesn't play a lick of defense, and they don't. They really do not play any defense. If you look at their game against Charlotte, they led 115 points, but they led 60 points at halftime. This is just who they are. They score a lot of points because they have a lot of star talent, but they don't play defense. And I understand Kevin Durant and Kyrie have proven to get it done in the playoffs. I get that, right? But James Harden hasn't, even though I think this version of James Harden is a much better version than the other versions he's been. But you're banking on being able to outscore teams in the playoffs, and that doesn't always come out that way. They could get away with that if they play like the Miami Heat in the first round and possibly the Bucks, right? But if they play Philly, I don't think they can just get away with that because Philly's a much better defensive team. Well, Miami's actually a top 5 defensive team in the NBA, but the Sixers are much bigger, so I think that the size of Philly is going to make things more difficult for Brooklyn to score. I mean, even watch the game. I mean, look, they scored 117 points, but a lot of that wasn't against Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. It was just because the bench guys weren't able to close out the game. However, when I look at the Nets, the only guys that really can play defense are like Alize Johnson and Bruce Brown and possibly Kevin Durant, right? Kevin Durant's a very good defender when he's motivated, but he also is very offensive centric. Again, you watch him play; they don't play defense, and I'm harping on this fact because you need defense to win championships, and they're 25th in defensive efficiency, and there's no team that's that bad defensively that's ever won an NBA championship. Can Brooklyn certainly win an NBA championship? Absolutely. Right? Should they still be favored to get out of the East? Sure, absolutely. But I think Philly has proven to people that they actually are in that conversation and can actually beat the Nets. And I think that the only problem I see with Philly is the fact that Ben Simmons is kind of useless in the half court because he can't shoot. And I'm not saying useless in the sense of like he hurts the team. I'm saying that like unfortunately teams can sag off of him and double an Embiid. And if he was cutting more off the ball, I think that would make him more of a threat offensively. Because I think actually he does a lot of really good stuff in transition. I think he's a defensive player of the year. But what you see when Embiid's not in the lineup, he can have more space to attack. And he's actually a really good scorer when he's got that opportunity. However, you saw against Brooklyn and you saw against the Clippers too. It's just he doesn't have a jump shot and teams just lay off of him because he doesn't have a ridiculously amazing post game. It's decent, but again, that's where like the term of I'm putting useless in quotation marks because he's not really useless, but he's not helping in the sense that he can because he's so talented, but yet he can't really shoot. Or wants to shoot. So that's gonna I think hurt them a little bit. But I don't think it's gonna be as big of a deal because I think if he learns to cut off the basketball, I think him and Embiid can work perfectly fine. And what's interesting about this game, too, is that, this is my last point, is that Brooklyn played better with Kyrie off the floor, which I found a little interesting. Like, Brooklyn had a positive plus-minus from their bench, and when Kyrie was on the floor, they were minus 13 with him on the floor. Now, Kyrie played an excellent game, but again, you can have 37 points, if it doesn't amount to winning, no one's going to care. And it's not that Kyrie's not a great player. He is. He's unbelievable, but his mindset's a score. And unfortunately, you watch that game, he plays hard. He tries to play hard defensively, but he's not a good defender. And also, if you look at the fact that he's not really getting his guys entirely crazy involved, he tries, but his mindset's a score. And even though he can score at a high level, they just they can't guard anyone when he's on the court. And defensively, he's just a big liability, and he wants to score a lot. So that just shows you again about the problem with Brooklyn defensively. I think with just and the fact that their stars might not be as impactful individually as they are collectively, but again, it comes down to chemistry there too. Now, in terms of their game against the Clippers from the Sixers angle, the Sixers won again 106-103. The Clippers made it interesting, right? The Clippers were down 20-3 and then came back and was up 91-90. They didn't win. The Sixers won. But the Sixers had 36 and 14 from Embiid. They didn't have Tobias Harris or Seth Curry. Now, Paul George had 37 points and played exceptionally well besides having 7 turnovers. He really showed a lot of what he can be in the playoffs. And I think if you look at this, the big differences in this game were turnovers and rebounding, right? And just Embiid's dominance. But for the people understand, Kawhi also didn't play last night for the Clippers, right? So this wasn't really a best picture of like what the series would really be like if these teams played against each other in the NBA Finals. But I think it did show that Philly has a lot of grit to overcome messing up leads and still closing the game out, right? I think that you look at that, the Sixers do struggle with big leads. They have in certain times this year, but being able to actually still close out that game and win that game shows a little bit more maturity than they have had in the past. And I think also with them, like I said, it was the turnovers and rebounds that were key to this game, right? The Clippers shot a much better percentage from 3. They shot a little less percentage from 2, but it was pretty even. And it went down to rebounding. The Clippers had 19 turnovers. That's a lot of extra possessions for Embiid and Simmons to get transition buckets and for Embiid to get a lot of buckets down low. The Sixers only had 12, right? So what this shows me is the defense of Philadelphia is legit at causing turnovers and making it really hard, right? And rebounding-wise, the Sixers out-rebounded the Clippers by 3. Joel Embiid had 14 rebounds. Ben Simmons had 9. Again, when you pound teams on the glass and you consistently harp on that and make it really difficult for them to score, it's really hard for a team to get back in the game if you're just continuously crashing the glass, getting a lot of rebounds, and getting extra possessions for your team. It just makes things very difficult to win. I think also you got to look at a few different points as well, in the sense that Philadelphia's got the number 2 defense, right? They got the number 2 defense in the NBA. I think also you have to look at the fact that Embiid was really dominant, right? He's averaged basically, he scored over 35 in his last 3 games, and he just looks really dominant. He's turning down threes and taking better shots from 2. It's important, but I also think the fact is that you have Tobias Harris, right, who's a legitimate scorer. And when he's fully healthy, this team can beat anyone because if the role players really come up to play, like a Shake Milton, Furkan Korkmaz, Dwight Howard, Mike Scott, George Hill when he's finally healthy. You can put Tyrese Maxey in there when he gets his minutes. Again, they have a real legitimate shot. And the fact is that Embiid is so dominant, right? It's not just the fact that he shoots a good percentage from the floor. He leads the NBA in free throws made and free throws attempted per game. He averages a little under 12 free throws attempted a game. He's become the big man version of James Harden in terms of getting free throws. He's fantastic at it. And that puts a lot of bigs in foul trouble, especially if you're Brooklyn, if you're Boston possibly, right? If your big guys are in foul trouble, you're not in good shape because you could go small against Embiid, but Embiid is athletic enough where at least he can make things harder on a guard if they get a switch onto a big. And then if you, from an offensive angle, if you have small and Embiid, he's just going to destroy him. And it showed against Brooklyn. No one on Brooklyn could guard him. Jeff Green couldn't guard him. Nick Claxton couldn't guard him. DeAndre Jordan couldn't guard him. If Kevin Durant was there, he probably couldn't guard him. And it's not saying that these guys aren't legitimate defenders or like no one but it's just Embiid's a very difficult guard when he's motivated because he can shoot the 3. He's a really good mid-range shooter. He's excellent in the post. He's got really good footwork. And he plays at his pace in the post. Like he's very smart in how he wants to get his moves. And that's come from being in a mature state and also having a coach that's going to properly motivate you to get the most out of your game. So it does show that even though Brett Brown, I think it was a good coach, it shows that how much of a motivation had to go into Embiid's play, right? I think he was motivated the fact that he was ranked lower than a lot of the bigs, but I think the fact that he's playing consistently good every night, playing at an MVP level, that's the big difference there too. And you also look at the fact, I mentioned this a few times on this segment, is that Philadelphia has an unbelievable defense, right? They're number 2 in the NBA, right? They're number 2 in the NBA. They're 5th in field goal percentage. They're top 5 in three-point percentage. So their length, their athleticism, their physicality defensively, I think that Doc Rivers also is a good defensive coach. You can look at his times with Boston and currently now with the Philadelphia 76ers, right? When he has the right guys to build a good defensive team, they usually always are really good defensively. And you have a defensive player of the year, in my opinion, in Ben Simmons. You could also put Joel Embiid in that conversation. Danny Green, even though he's older, can play defense. Matisse Thybulle is an excellent defender. That's why he gets the minutes he does. But everyone on that team plays defense. It's not like, you only give it to 3 guys and they play hard defense. No, like the majority of the guys play really hard, aggressive defense. Dwight Howard, when he plays, he's constantly trying to block shots and get rebounds and play from a physical mindset on the defensive end. And that's important because Brooklyn is not the most physical team. They're offensively really gifted. And if you can get physical with them, because I think that's the only way you can really beat Brooklyn. That's why I think Philadelphia has the formula at least to beat them. Because you got to be really physical with Brooklyn and get up into the shooters' airspaces like Joe Harris, Kevin Durant, Kyrie. You got to pressure these guys. Even though Kyrie and Kevin Durant are going to still score pressure in the face, same thing with James Harden. But if you can add a physical component, that's the reason why I think Philly has the defensive blueprint to at least give Brooklyn some trouble. I don't think many other teams in the East do. Like Miami's very physical, but Miami's a little too small. Milwaukee's a big team, but they're not really entirely great defensively, especially guarding the 3. They're one of the worst in the NBA at it. So I look at all that stuff and I say, okay, Philadelphia's got a real chance. But I think from the Clippers angle, right, you got to look at some positives, right? Paul George has played unbelievable recently. And the fact that he's averaging over 30 points in his last 6 games, and he had a really big game last night too. If he plays like this, the Clippers can totally win the NBA championship. It all comes down to him, and if Kawhi Leonard doesn't have bad fourth quarters like he did from games 5 through 7 against the Denver Nuggets in last year's playoffs. But to relate it back to the Philadelphia 76ers, these wins, even though they were not probably the most clean in terms of having the level of urgency to close out the games, what it showed me is that Joel Embiid has a legitimate mentality of dominating his opponent. And if you look, what I mean by like a legitimate mentality is the fact that he has a legitimate dominant personality now. And his mentality is like, I'm going to go dominate you every night. I'm going to use my strength, my skill, my size, my athleticism, and impose my will on the defense every night. And then again, you have Tobias Harris, who's an excellent offensive player. You got Ben Simmons, he's an all-star. He's an excellent transition player, excellent guy, playmaking, and he's good on the glass, and he's unreal defensively, right? He might be the best perimeter defender in the league right now, maybe outside of Drew Holiday right now. And that's the thing I'm going to bring up, is that Philly's legit, right? They are legit in the NBA. They are just a legit team, right? Last year, they were the 6th seed in the Eastern Conference because they didn't live up to their potential, because they weren't properly motivated, because Embiid was not imposing his will every night. And this year, Embiid took all that stuff very personally. Doc Rivers gave him the proper motivation and told him what the level of urgency he had to play with. But I think you look at all this stuff, you look at the way he plays, and it's pretty obvious that Embiid is an excellent player. And it's not just he's an excellent player. He's one of the best players in the NBA right now. And if he plays like this in the postseason, guys like Brook Lopez will not stop him. Robert Williams from the Celtics or Clint Capella will not stop him. And then if they play the Nets, which I think they will, DeAndre Jordan or Kevin Durant or Jeff Green or Nick Claxton, they're not going to be able to guard him, right? And if you double team him, he's going to be able to kick out to those shooters. And if those guys hit their shots, which they've been able to hit recently, and they've been doing better at this season, it's going to be really tough to beat this team because they're so good defensively. And Embiid's going to wear big guys out through his physicality and his play. And Ben Simmons also going to wear guys out by getting up at a track meet. And then Tobias Harris too, right? He's a guy who's very physical scorer. And this is why I think Philly's a legitimate team. Are they a favorite to come out of the East? I think they're one of the 2 favorites, right? It's them and Brooklyn. I think that's pretty obvious. But can Brooklyn come out of the East? 100%, right? I think a lot of people think that Brooklyn is going to. I'm just saying I think Philadelphia has a legitimate shot to come out of the Eastern Conference too. And I think that these two games definitely proved it, even though there were some concerns. You can see why they can be so dominant in the playoffs and why they can be so dangerous in the playoffs. And I think that's just a point for everyone to understand, is this team is legit and they have the pieces to at least win an NBA championship if they're clicking on all cylinders. We're going to take a quick commercial break here, but when I come back, we're going to break down the play-in tournament, the drama behind that, my thoughts on the play-in tournament generally. And then also, later on in the segments, we're going to talk about the Atlanta Hawks' success, as well as why I think super teams are really bad for the NBA. All that coming back up after this break. See you guys soon.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mike, Shredder. And my last segment, if you guys didn't get to check it out, was what my thoughts on the big games that Philadelphia had this week against Brooklyn and the Clippers, which they both won, and why I think they are a legitimate contender to get out of the Eastern Conference, and why people should look at them as such and not just think that Brooklyn is going to definitely win the East. Also, later on in the show, I'm going to be breaking down why the Atlanta Hawks have been so successful, as well as why I think super teams are bad for the NBA and are really hurting the competition angle of the sport in general. But this segment is about the whole play-in tournament, right? There's been a lot of criticisms about it and also some positivity around it. And basically, what I'm going to do on this segment is explain what the controversy has been, as well as the positives of it, why people think it's a good thing, and then also explain to you what my opinion on it is as a whole concept. So let's start off with just the controversy, right? There's been recent criticisms from the Dallas Mavericks about the play-in tournament, right? Luka Doncic came out and said, I don't see the point in it. You play 72 games again in the playoffs, then maybe you lose 2 in a row and you're out of the playoffs, right? That was a quote he said. And Cuban said, in quote, in hindsight, it was an enormous mistake. And Luka did also say that the Mavs are trying to get the 6th spot. And basically, the way the play-in is formatted is that 7 through 10 have to play in this play-in tournament, right? 7 plays 8 to get the 7th seed. 8 plays the winner of 9 and 10 to get the 8th seed. And that's going to determine 7 through 8 in the postseason standings in either conference. Draymond Green also came out earlier in March or that period and said basically that he had no motivation just to fight for a play-in tournament at Ridgewood. Now, he's played a lot better than that recently. He actually had a bunch of triple-doubles recently. But he said that that was kind of behind his motivation. He's like, I'd rather try to play for a championship, not to just get the 8th seed. But that's the criticism behind it. People think that it's good because you get more teams an opportunity to play in the tournament. With a COVID condensed season, it's going to give more teams an opportunity to fight for a playoff spot. And look, Dallas right now is 7th in the West currently. The Golden State's 9th in the West currently. And that's the whole idea about it, right? The negatives is that you're fighting, you play 72 games to get the certain seed. Why do you have to play in a play-in tournament to determine if you're in the playoffs or not? And the positive angle is, well, it's a condensed season, a lot of COVID pauses here and there. This gives every team an opportunity to at least fight for a playoffs because the season's very different than other seasons that have been through normal life situations. So I get both arguments, but my thoughts are more in line with the Dallas Mavericks in the sense that I don't really like the idea of the play-in tournament. And the reason why I don't like it is primarily because if you're a 7th or 8th seed, right, you're fighting all year to get into that spot. There's 8 teams allowed in the playoffs. That's all it should be. I understood it more when it was in the bubble, right, because the bubble was a very different situation. It was very condensed. Giving that teams an opportunity was actually a really good thing, I think. But I don't think it's good now, right? You have 72 games. The teams generally have been able to play most of their games. And I don't really like the idea because here's another thing, right? In the Western Conference, it's much tougher to get a 7th and 8th seed, right? So Dallas being a 7th seed, they would be the 4th seed right now in the Eastern Conference. And them fighting all year through COVID pauses and injuries to get to that spot, they should be rewarded for it. There shouldn't be a play-in tournament to determine if they deserve that 7th seed or not. And like I just said before, COVID pauses and injuries affect the circumstances around the 7th or 8th seed. So it's more rewarding when you get that 7th or 8th seed. And if you look at the Eastern Conference, right, you're like teams like Miami or Charlotte, you're not rewarding those teams in terms of Miami. Look, Miami's fought through a lot of COVID pauses, through a lot of difficult stretches and during the season to get that 7th seed, right? You look at Charlotte, for example, right? Charlotte has fought all year to be an 8th seed, right? They've really surprised everyone. They've had injuries to LaMelo Ball and Gordon Hayward recently, and they've still been able to keep afloat and be an 8th seed, right? They should be rewarded for that. They shouldn't have to play in a play-in tournament and give teams like the Toronto Raptors and the Indiana Pacers a chance to get in the playoffs. If you're below the 8th seed, you don't deserve to be in the playoffs. I'm sorry, you don't. You don't deserve it because that means you didn't play well enough to get to that spot. And that's the problem with all this, is that just in terms of like a team in the Western Conference, right? Like Memphis has fought all year to get to that 8th seed, right? And the Western Conference is tough. It's grueling. It has 2 of the best records in the NBA and are the first 2 seeds in that conference. And that's the big issue I look at this. I sit there and I'm saying, I don't really get this whole play-in tournament. I don't get it this year. I got it last year. That made sense for the 8-9, but why are you allowing a 7 through 10 matchup? Because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, in my opinion. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think it's very good. I don't think it properly rewards teams for the regular season. There's no real emphasis on the regular season. And that's kind of the way I look at it, right? And this is the one thing, too, is that when you're trying to... I've talked about teams not taking the regular season seriously, right? You can take a look at teams like the Clippers in 2019 through 2020. This year, it's the Brooklyn Nets. And with the whole load management thing, right? I've talked about that on other shows I've had, and in the sense that load management, I think, is not a good concept, because I think it does take away the chemistry angle, the reliability angle, and also the fact of making the regular season actually mean something, right? The regular season doesn't actually mean something if you're just having players sit out all these games, and that's a problem, right? The regular season means a lot to these teams who are fighting for that 7th and 8th seed, and they fought all year to get to that spot. Now, look, Dallas has been a little disappointing, right? Everyone expected them to probably be higher up in the standings, but they fought all year to get to that point, right? They didn't sit around and tank the regular season. No, they fought all year to get to that 7th spot, right? They're looking to get to the 6th spot, which is a good thing, but they fought all year to get to that spot, and that's why the play-in tournament doesn't make a lot of sense, right? If you look at teams like the Knicks, right? The Knicks are the 6th seed right now in the East, but they could easily be 7th, right? And you're saying, okay, if you're the 7th seed, you got to play against Toronto and Indiana, who aren't playoff teams at the moment. They have losing records. That's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous concept. I don't really understand it. I get they're trying to accommodate to COVID and the COVID condensed season. Like, I'm sympathetic to that, but the problem I have from a grand scheme of things is I just think it just really undermines the importance of the regular season, importance of coming out ready to play every night, right? That's the big problem. That's a huge problem when it comes to this play-in problem, is that you're not rewarding the teams that have played consistently to get to that spot. You're not rewarding the regular season. You're saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter. And which is a huge stigma that's been a negative, unfortunate stigma around the NBA right now, because you look at the super teams, you look at load management, now this, people are like, well, the regular season doesn't matter. Like in football, right? Football, it matters a whole lot, right? Because certain teams have to play well in the regular season or else they don't make the postseason, right? That's why the regular season is important in every sport. You have to play well in order to get into the playoffs. And you don't need a play-in tournament to determine that. It's ridiculous. College basketball, right? The certain teams that were on the bubble had to get in by using the regular season and playing well in their conference tournaments, right? But you look at the low-end teams, right? They had to have a good regular season, right? If they didn't have a good regular season, they weren't going to be in. And that's why like a team like Wake Forest in the ACC obviously didn't have a great chance of getting into the NCAA tournament because they didn't have a good regular season. Syracuse obviously is a different story because Syracuse was really good late toward the year, but they had to play well in the regular season. They had to play well in that conference tournament in order to get in, right? They don't get a play-in tournament to get the opportunity. I mean, they had like that first 4 play-in tournament in a sense, like, determined seeding, but that was their playoffs in a sense, right? But like, I don't like the play-in tournament in the NBA because you're taking away the regular season's impact. And this is one thing that has been a stereotype around the NBA for the last couple of years, is they've been taking away the importance of the regular season to certain teams. And like teams like the Warriors and the Clippers and now the Brooklyn Nets don't take it seriously because they're like, oh, we got a 2nd seed. We can just coast. And the 7th and 8th seed now have to play against teams that aren't playoff quality teams. I'm not saying in terms of talent, but in terms of how they're playing this season. And then you're just going to reward it the 10th seed they possibly win. Like, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's the issue, right? Like, let's say San Antonio beats out Golden State and beats out Memphis, for example, right? So they get the 8th seed? That's ridiculous. They didn't play well enough. They didn't play as well as Memphis did all season. They didn't play as well as Golden State did all season. They don't deserve that seed. If you're a 7th or 8th seed and that's where you are at the end of the regular season, that's what you deserve to be seeded. If you're the 9th seed, you're not in the playoffs. It's just the play-in tournament. I look, again, like I said, I'm sympathetic because it's a condensed season, difficult circumstances. This is what they thought was best, right? But it's just unfortunate this is not the best circumstances, because for a team like Dallas, a team that has young talent that deserves to be in the playoffs for being a 7th seed, now they have to fight to be able to be a 7th seed or even the playoffs generally. I don't like that whole concept. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that's the thought on it. But in reality, unfortunately, even though I'm not a fan of the play-in tournament, it's occurring, right? And there's nothing that we can do as fans or the players can do to stop it at this moment. So there's a few things I'm gonna talk about in terms of that, in terms of the reality of the situation, right? And it's that in the way that's being constructed, if you think that this is not the best thing and that you deserve to be the 7th or 8th seed, well, now you have to just go prove it, and you should prove it. If you're better than those teams, prove it, right? If you're Dallas, prove that you're better than Memphis, right? If you're Memphis, prove that you're better than Dallas. And then if the 9 versus 10 matchup happens, prove that you're better than those teams too, like Golden State and San Antonio at this moment. Because if you prove that, then you're going to be in the playoffs, right? It's a situation that's at hand, right? I'm not a fan of this play-in tournament. I just spoke for a few minutes on this, right? It's not a good concept. It doesn't reward the regular season. But since it's unfortunately here, those teams have to prove that they deserve to be in the playoffs, right? Miami's got to prove they're better than Charlotte. Charlotte's going to have to prove maybe they're better than Miami. Or they have to prove that they're better than teams like Toronto or Indiana at this moment, right? I get it, right? COVID has made things very difficult, right? A lot of players have been in and out of the lineup. Injuries also have affected a lot of teams this season because of the condensed schedule. The play-in tournament doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but since it's there, you got to prove it, right? There's no excuses now, because you can say, oh, well, we had a 7th seed, we deserved it. Well, you're in the play-in tournament, you got to just go out there and win those games, right? If you're better than those teams, you should go out there and prove it, right? And that's the whole concept I sit with there and make that determination, is that if you're good enough to make the playoffs, you should just easily coast through this play-in tournament. It shouldn't be that hard, right? Whether or not I don't think it's a good concept, because I think it doesn't reward the regular season, like I said many times so far in this segment, because I think the regular season is so important. I think it's important because those teams have to get those seeds by having a good regular season. But now, since the play-in tournament's there, you got to go prove it. If you're Dallas, right, go prove it, right? Try to get to the 6th seed so you're not in that play-in spot, right? Make Portland get in that play-in spot, right? So you're not in that position, because Portland's got the tiebreaker over you. Try to get a better record than them, right? Win the games you're supposed to win. Don't lose to the Knicks like you lost the other night, right? Don't lose to them. Win the games you're supposed to win, right? You beat Memphis. That's a game you have to win, right? That's the argument I'm only making here, is that while I'm totally understanding that the NBA did what was best, the play-in tournament does not make sense, and it's not something that should be replicated ever again in the future. It should not be replicated again, because it really hurts the regular season. It really hurts the players' opportunities to benefit from the regular season. But since it's here, you got to go prove it. You got to get the job done. And that's how it is at the end of the day, right? You got to go prove it, get the job done, and win these play-in games when you get the opportunity to play. And that may not be fair, right? But unfortunately, right, that's the situation you have at hand, right? And you got to go do it. If you're Luka Doncic, if you're one of the best players in the NBA, right, you should not be losing those play-in games, right? You should beat Memphis, and you should get to the 7th seed, and that's it, right? Now, it's easier said than done in the Western Conference, for example, because the Western Conference is so tough, right? The Warriors have a 500 record. The Grizzlies are 5 games over 500 at this moment, and the Mavericks are 6 games over 500 at this period of time, right? So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but if you're presented with that situation, you got to get the job done, right? And I get it, right? It's like, I'm going to say it again. This is not something that should be replicated. But unfortunately, right, things that aren't good sometimes in life, you got to just deal with and make the most out of it, right? If you're Dallas, get the 6th seed, right? Get the 6th seed, put Portland in that tough spot, right? Because if you do that, you're going to avoid the play-in spot, right? Like, I'm a Knicks fan, right? And then, I'm hoping the Knicks don't have to play in that play-in game, right? Stay at that 6th seed, continue to play good basketball, so you won't have to be in that position when it comes time to do that, right? Right now, Dallas is 2 games behind Portland for the 6th seed, right? If they're as legitimate as they say, and my apologies, Dallas is 5 games over 500, and the Grizzlies are 2 games over 500 at this period of time. But that it's still harboring the point, right? If Dallas thinks they deserve to be in the playoffs, which they do, right? They're 7th seed. They've been doing that all year. Get the 6th spot so you don't have to be in that play-in situation. And look, if you're in the play-in, win those games, right? Beat Memphis, beat Golden State or the San Antonio, whoever wins that. Because I don't think New Orleans is going to get in that playoff spot. They just don't play good enough defense. And if you're in the East, right? If you're teams like Miami and Charlotte at this moment in time, right? If you're Miami, don't lose to Charlotte, right? And if Charlotte loses, right, don't lose to Indiana or Toronto, right? Win these games, right? Make the most out of that situation. That's the whole point. But in conclusion, I'm going to harp on this because I want to make this point, and I made it crystal clear throughout the entire segment. The play-in tournament is not a good idea, right? It's not rewarding the regular season, and by not rewarding the regular season, you're saying it doesn't matter. And these players are playing 72 to 80, possibly 82 games to win a championship, get in good playoff position to go win that NBA championship. The regular season helps develop chemistry. It helps develop rhythm. It helps develop team continuity. It helps develop a sense of identity within the team. They have to develop an identity during the year. You can't just throw them in the playoffs and expect them to be good, right? They have to work off the rust a little bit. They have to work out their chemistry issues. They got to get used to playing in certain games, right? So that's the whole point I'm going to make here, right? Is that, you're not rewarding a team like Dallas for their work through all the year they've been doing, right? You're not rewarding a team like Charlotte, who's like overcome the odds and become the 8th seed in the East, right? That's the whole point around this whole argument. And that's why I think that's the problem with this play-in tournament, right? You already have players who don't take the regular season seriously on these super teams, right? Now you're just giving more of incentive for the regular season not to matter. Oh, if you're the 10th seed, no worries about it. Just make sure you're 10th seed. Have a bad record because you'll play in the play-in tournament. Think about the incentive that is, right? It's not rewarding winners. It's not rewarding successful play. And that's the problem with the play-in tournament, right? That's why I understand it was because of the condensed season and because of COVID. They had to adjust and make things, in their terms, fair for everyone. But unfortunately, there is also the problem of it not being fair for the 7th or 8th seed who fought all year in the regular season to get to that spot. That's the problem with the play-in tournament, right? That's why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And, Miami's had a crazy year, right? They've had COVID pauses left and right. They've had injuries to different players. And they're the 7th seed right now, right? They're the 7th seed. So you're not gonna reward them for being in that 7th seed with all that stuff that's been going on. If you're Dallas, right? Dallas has had Luka Doncic come in a little out of shape. Porzingis has been injured left and right. Bad play by some of the role players to start the season. And they're the 7th seed right now. So you're not going to reward them for the regular season, right? You're just going to say, well, if you're the Spurs who have dropped 2 games recently and below 500, you got a great chance to make the playoffs. If you're in the East and you're like a Toronto, well, you're 23-34 and have a really bad season. Oh, but you can play in the play-in tournament and make the playoffs. I think you guys are seeing why this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because it's just not rewarding any sort of winning and success. It's rewarding, teams just to be fair and give everyone a chance, right? It's not actually rewarding the proper success, the proper attention to the regular season, and the dedication to actually get to those seats, because it's not easy to do that, right? It's not easy to do that. Greg Popovich is arguably the best coach in the NBA. His team's not in playoff. I mean, they're in the 10th seed right now, right? But if the playoffs started today and there was no play-in tournament, his team would not be in the playoffs. Golden State has Steph Curry, and they're the 9th seed right now in the West, and he's played unbelievable this season, right? It's not easy to get those seeds, and you're not rewarding the regular season success, and you're not rewarding good play, and you're just basically just kind of giving everyone a chance to get in the playoffs when teams with losing records shouldn't be in the playoffs, right? They just should not be, right? That's the stigma around the East being so bad for years, is that they've had this regular season, and teams have had losing records and get in the playoffs, and they just get blasted in the first round. Now you have teams in the Eastern Conference, at least, besides Charlotte, who have at least gotten 500 or better records, and they've worked all year to get to that point. And that's the problem with the play-in tournament, is that you're not rewarding those guys for all that effort and work they put in. That's why the play-in tournament doesn't make a lot of sense. But with all that being said, since it's occurring, if you're that team 7 through 8, you got to just prove that you're better than those 9 and 10 teams, right? You got to prove it, right? If you think you deserve to be in the playoffs, go prove it, get the job done, win those games, and get in the postseason, right? That's what you have to do ultimately, right? Life is full of situations that don't always seem fair or right, but if you're in that situation, you got to have sometimes, approach it with a positive mindset and tackle it with the best way you can to get the ultimate success out of it, right? And that's what these teams can do in this situation. We're going to take a quick commercial break here, but when I come back on, we're going to break down the Atlanta Hawks' success, because it's been really interesting how they've become successful over the past 20 to 22 games or so. And also, we're going to break down later in the show why super teams are bad for the NBA and how it's ruined kind of the competition angle of the sport. All that coming back up when I see you guys on the next segment.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Michael Schroeder. This podcast is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And look, my last segment, guys, if you guys didn't get it out, you get a chance to check it out, it was about the whole idea of the play-in tournament, why I thought it was a bad idea to have this season, the whole drama behind it. I also explained why the NBA decided to do it, and ultimately why I thought it was a bad idea. Also, later on in the show, I'm going to break down why creating super teams is bad for the NBA and just not a great product that has been allowed to become more and more prevalent in the league as years have transpired. But I'm going to break down a more positive segment on this show, and that's going to be about the success of the Atlanta Hawks. The Atlanta Hawks, going into the season, people thought were going to be a playoff team, right? They had Trae Young, John Collins, Clint Capella, Kevin Huerter, Cam Reddish, DeAndre Hunter, right? Talented pieces. And they also got great free agency moves, right? Rajon Rondo. They got Bogdan Bogdanovic. They got Danilo Gallinari, just to name a few of their free agent acquisitions. Unfortunately, under Lloyd Pierce, and this is not always his fault, but under Lloyd Pierce, it didn't quite click. They were 11th in the East. They had a 23rd defensive rating in the NBA. They weren't exceptional enough offensively. Trae Young was really shooting a bad percentage. It turned the ball over a lot. And it was concerning, obviously, for a lot of people to look at, right? Because Atlanta was supposed to be a really good team, and they were 11th in the Eastern Conference. But on March 1st, they got rid of Lloyd Pierce and replaced him with Nate McMillan as the interim head coach. Now, Nate McMillan, I think, is going to be the head coach for years to come for this team, because under Nate McMillan, the team has went 16-5 so far this season with him as the head coach. Right now, they went from 11th in the Eastern Conference to 4th in the Eastern Conference. And the thing I'm going to break down about Atlanta is that this is a pretty remarkable turnaround, right? I understand the Eastern Conference is very congested between 4 and 11, right? It's very congested in terms of one day one team is going to be 4 and they can be 8 the next week depending on how they play. They lose a bunch of games. I acknowledge all of that. That makes a lot of sense. But the point I'm going to bring up to you guys is that Atlanta has done a really good job, right? Nate McMillan has really got this team to turn it around. And look, they're not beating the best teams, right? They didn't beat Milwaukee the other night. They haven't quite got over the hump. Like if they played Boston the first round, I would take Boston in that series. But I think that they aren't losing games that they should win, right? They've been winning the games they're supposed to win. And that's important, right? Because if you don't beat the teams you're supposed to beat and you also aren't beating the best teams, you're not going to be a very good basketball team. And that's why they're fourth right now, right? They have a lot of young pieces. They have explosive talent in Trae Young and John Collins. Also, Clint Capella is a really good piece as well. And guys like Bogdan Bogdanovic can really shoot it, as well as Danilo Gallinari. And that's the whole idea here, is that Atlanta's really been playing much better basketball, right? And I think a thing that we have to realize is Nate McMillan has been the key instrument in that whole transformation of this team. And the one thing I want to break down first is that he's opened up the players' strengths, right? He's allowed Bogdanovic and Gallinari to really focus on just being three-point shooters, right? That's where they are best at, and he's really opened up the offense to get those guys opportunities to do that, right? And you look at Bogdan Bogdanovic, he's had a 28-point game. He's had a 25-point game. He's really become a much more explosive scorer because he's been allowed to have more freedom to shoot the three and gotten better looks from three as a result of the new changes in Nate McMillan's offense. Also, he wasn't really healthy for a lot of the year also, so that also contributed to the play of him earlier because he wasn't completely healthy at the start of the season. I think also you're looking at Trae Young, right? Trae Young has had fewer 7 turnover games in the 21-game stretch than they did previous to that, right? He had a lot of games earlier where he had like 8 or 9 turnovers because he tried to force the issue too much. Trae Young still sometimes forces the issue a little too much because you're going to turn the ball over a lot as a point guard anyways because you have the ball in your hands so much, right? But I think the fact that he's playing more under control, not forcing things, getting guys involved, is allowing him to right now shoot a better percentage from the floor. He's averaging more points, and that's because Nate McMillan is an experienced coach, right? Lloyd Pierce, I think, will be a good coach in the NBA, right? I think he's going to have to find his way, but I think he'll eventually become a good coach, right? He's a little bit younger, right? Hasn't had the experience as a Nate McMillan has. And experience proves big time when you're trying to transform players, right? You're going to figure out from coaching with different teams and scouting, watching film, what the strengths of players in your teams are and where best to maximize those strengths. And for players like a Bogdan Bogdanovic, a Danilo Gallinari, it's shooting, right? For a player like Clint Capella, it's a lot of easy rim run actions, pick and roll actions, quick, easy post-ups, right? For John Collins, it's allowing him to be versatile from the post, the mid-post, hit the three off a pick and pop, right? Play in transition, play off pick and roll. And for Trae Young, right, it's putting him through a lot of ball screens and telling him to be a little bit calmer and play at a slower pace in order to make the correct decisions. So he's allowed that to happen. But also you look at the fact that guys in this team are accepting their role, right? Kevin Huerter is accepting his role as just being a three-point shooter, right? But they haven't had Cam Reddish, who averages 11.2 points a game during much of the stretch, and DeAndre Hunter, who averages 16 points a game, right? Those are two key offensive players. Now, Cam Reddish is not an efficient scorer whatsoever. He's got a lot of talent on him, though. And DeAndre Hunter is a good defender who can score and shoot the three. And again, 16 points a game is very, very solid as you are trying to build a team, right? If they get those guys back, this team could probably give Boston a tough series because what they've improved is that their defensive efficiency has went up, right? They were 21st in defensive efficiency. Sorry, they're 21st now in defensive efficiency. They were 23rd under Lloyd Pierce. Now, it's been incremental, obviously. They haven't turned it up into being like a top 15 defensive team or even a top 5 like Nate McMillan was with the Indiana Pacers, but they're at least learning how to play better defense. And that's important, right? Like I stated before, Brooklyn Nets have the most talented team in the NBA. I don't think it's even disputed that they had the most talented team in the NBA, even without LaMarcus Aldridge. However, the thing that concerns me the most is their defense, right? They don't guard anyone very effectively. And Atlanta was a team like that too. The reason they weren't in the postseason picture is because They were inefficient on offense in terms of field goal percentage for their stars, and they were terrible defensively. Now they've been able to, my apologies, they were 24th in defensive efficiency, not 23rd. So that's even worse, right? They moved up 3 spots in defensive efficiency. So you think about that makes a big difference as you progress forwards into getting to a playoff contending type of level, right? I don't think this team's a contending team to get out of the East. I think they're a first or second round exit, but Nate McMillan has built a good culture with the defense, right? They're 11th in shooting defense. They're 12th in points allowed. They're 8th in total rebounds. Now that's important, right? Because the NBA is a very efficiently high-scoring game based on the rules, based on how good players have become skilled-wise, based on how offenses are run. So the fact that you're holding teams 11th in field goal percentage, right, is excellent. The fact that you're 12th in points allowed is excellent. The fact that they're also a top 15 team, they're a top 12 team in 3-point percentage defense is excellent. And the fact that you're also 8th in total rebounds, right? That goes down to John Collins and Clint Capella, who really rebound at a high level. And you want to keep teams off the glass, right? You give teams extra opportunities to score, they're going to take full advantage of that, right? That's just how it works, right? They're going to take full advantage of that opportunity and make the most of those opportunities, because if you give them extra chances, more 3-point shooting opportunities for better stars to get better looks, right? A lot of easy threes and high efficient shots come off of offensive rebounds. The fact that they're 8th in rebounds, and look, that also contributes to the fact that they are a good offensive rebounding team as well with John Collins and Clint Capella. But defensively, they're keeping teams off the glass, right? That's one reason why Utah has been so successful this year, is because they're a really good rebounding team. One reason why the Knicks are very successful this year is because they're an excellent rebounding team. And that contributes to your defense, right? Less possessions, less opportunities to score for the other team, more opportunities for a young team like Atlanta to get out and transition. It really does make a huge difference. And if you think about that, that's a big, big difference. Now, going back to an earlier point, when I talked about role players stepping up, right? We're going to talk about players like Solomon Hill and Brandon Goodwin. And this ties directly into my defensive point. And the reason why it does is because Brandon Goodwin and Solomon Hill are guys that, when DeAndre Hunter and Cam Reddish come back, are probably not going to see a ton of minutes. But what they have been able to do during this time is take full advantage of their minutes, play excellent defense, make hustle plays, make open shots when they have the opportunity. And as a result of that, they get extra minutes. And Nate McMillan likes guys like that. You know, let's take an example, right? Lance Stevenson played a lot on those Nate McMillan Indiana Pacers team when they were a top 5 defensive team in 2018. And the reason why he did is because he could defend multiple positions, right? He was a guy that would get on loose balls, right? He's a bit of an irritant, but he wasn't like a crazy great scorer. And that Indiana team, even like a Miles Turner, right? The reason why Miles Turner has such value is because he could shoot threes, and he's an excellent shot blocker. And Nate McMillan used that because Nate McMillan knew that Miles Turner was not going to score 20 points a game. He can give you 10 to 15, but not always. He's not an always consistent offensive threat. He's gotten much better as his career has gone on. But he was great as a shot blocker and great as a three-point shooting threat. So he understood his role. And Nate McMillan's excellent at that. He understands how to get guys into a specific role that they can maximize to their potential. And that's a meaning of a good coach. You're only going to win if your star players and role players mesh well together, right? And so far, Atlanta has figured that out a little bit. And my apologies earlier, too. They are also 16-6 now because they just lost to Milwaukee. But still, it doesn't really matter, right? It's more about the fact of Nate McMillan has done an excellent job with this team. And I think that another point I'm going to make, too, is that the ascending great play of Clint Capella the last 8 games, right? He's averaging 19.5 points, 14 rebounds in the last 8 games. That's huge, right? People forget how good Clint Capella was and how instrumental I think he was for Houston, right? When Houston traded him away to go to small ball, I think that was the biggest mistake they made because their defense got a lot worse. They could get easily beaten up by players like LeBron James at the rim, Anthony Davis, right? We saw that in that series, right? They just got beaten up after the period of time because PJ Tucker, who I love PJ Tucker, but he was their center at 6'5", right? LeBron James is not going to have trouble finishing over PJ Tucker, and neither is Anthony Davis. Clint Capella at least was athletic enough where when they played against the Warriors, he didn't do a terrible job in switching situations. And also, he's a guy that can really rebound. He has at least he has a hook shot with his left hand, but he's really good on pick and rolls and really good as a catch and finish guy. He's excellent at that. Clint Capela's a really good big. He's really good at what he does. Good shot blocker, great rebounder, and he can give you, 18 to 20 points on rim runs, on pick and roll dives to the basket. And Nate McMillan has maximized that as well. You look at the last 8 games, right? 19.5 points and 14 rebounds. That's dominant. That's dominant performances by a guy who I've always liked because I think his impact is much bigger than people think. And he's been allowed to actually make a huge impact. And you see, right, they have 8th, like I said, they're 8th in total rebounds. That's a lot due to him, right? He gets a lot of rebounds. He puts a lot of pressure on defenses because of his offensive rebounding ability. And also defensively, he's a shot blocker who can also rebound at a high level. So you're keeping those teams off the glass, and you're also challenging those teams at the rim. And for guys like Trae Young who get double teamed or trapped on ball screens, having Clint Capela be a viable role option at the rim is a very easy option for him to be successful offensively as a passer. And Clint Capela has taken full advantage of that. And that's one thing that Nate McMillan's also really capitalized on. Now, also, I think that people are really not talking about, even though he's having a down year, the addition of what Lou Williams brings to Atlanta, right? Rondo, to his credit, has played really well in a Clippers uniform, right? He's had multiple double-figure games. He's playing much better than he did in Atlanta, right? But he was bad in Atlanta. He was having a really bad season. He was not playing at all to his best. He had, I think he was like 200 something in PER. He was averaging less than 4 points a game. He just wasn't making a whole lot of impact like he did in the postseason with the Lakers, and I think right now what he's doing with the Clippers, right? What Lou Williams brings, now Lou Williams is not great in the postseason. He's not bad, but he's not great. He's had his moments. He's also had games where he's not played very well. If you look at the 2019 season, he had really good games at Golden State, but also some bad ones. Last year's bubble experience was not very good for him. But the thing is, even though he's averaging only 12 points a game, that's an upgrade on your bench, right? Because you bring Gallinari off the bench, you're bringing him off the bench, and he's also shooting 50% from 3. He has more assists and less turnovers with Atlanta, which I think comes down to him playing at his pace, playing more free, and Nate McMillan also trusting him more, because Lou Williams is a guy you don't really have to coach a whole time, because Lou Williams has been in the league so long, and he's a professional scorer. He knows how to get a bucket anytime. And I think the fact he's only playing 24 minutes and he's giving you those efficient stats where he wasn't very efficient with the Los Angeles Clippers, that's important, right? He's not a good defender. He tries really hard defensively, but it's just his size when he goes against a lot of these bigger guards. He just struggles, right? It's sometimes people don't realize defense is also a very big on physicality, and your physical profile can make you a good defender or not sometimes too. You can overcome that, but ultimately sometimes it just backfires at the end. But Lou Williams is a great offensive piece. Even though 12 points a game is not super high level, what people don't realize is that 12 points a game still is an upgrade from what Rondo is giving you. And ultimately, that's a big difference for this team too, is that Lou Williams has been playing efficient while giving you those 12 points. So he's giving you more bench production offensively, and he's efficient with it. That's a key point that people, I think, aren't really recognizing, and what he's doing really well so far. Now, I'm also going to break down something else for you guys too, in the sense that what can Atlanta do in a playoff series if they went against the Celtics, for example, right? The Celtics are a more talented team. They've been playing really well recently. They should be favored in that series, right? I would probably say the Celtics would win that series. But Atlanta also doesn't have DeAndre Hunter or Cam Reddish yet. And I think under Nate McMillan, DeAndre Hunter's a guy that already plays defense, but Cam Reddish will play more motivated defense. And he's already gotten guys to play more efficient basketball by understanding the strengths and weaknesses of certain players, right? And they played better. They played really, they're competitive, right? They can compete in games. They're a good team. But I think it's going to be a mix of stars versus a team, right? Boston has two excellent stars, in two All-Stars, in Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, who've both been having big-time games recently. And then Atlanta has good chemistry now, right? They play inspired basketball. They move the ball. They have a star player. Well, I would say 2 star players in Trae Young and John Collins. Clint Capella is an excellent center, and I think that's going to put 6 or possibly even 7 games, depending on how well DeAndre Hunter and Cam Reddish get acclimated into the new system that Nate McMillan's running. But I think that the big reason why I think they can give him trouble is because Clint Capella is a problem in pick and roll situations. And if Boston wants to go small, Clint Capella is an unbelievable rebounder. It's not like he's going to bury you down the post like an Embiid or a Jokic or even a Giannis, right? But he's a guy that is really good in the pick and roll. He's really good at running the floor. He's excellent on the offensive glass, which are areas that Boston does struggle in, right? Boston's not a great defensive team. They've gotten better, but they're not a great defensive team. And Boston's small, right? And Atlanta's not that small, right? Clint Capella is 7 feet tall and John Collins is 6'9". Both those guys are aggressive, athletic, offensive rebounders. So as a result of that, I look at that and say, Boston should win that series, but Atlanta could totally give them a series. And I wouldn't be surprised if Atlanta even won that series, right? Because Atlanta has figured out under Nate McMillan who they are, right? They figured out that they're a fast-paced team that has to play better defense and just needs to take care of the ball, right? They're young, they're athletic, they're vibrant, they're fun to watch, right? Because they play at a fast pace. They get rebounds and they just go, right? They play fast because they got Trae Young, they got Bogdan Bogdanovic, they got John Collins, they got DeAndre Hunter coming back, they have Kevin Huerter who wants to shoot threes, Clint Capella can run the floor up and down, no problem. And that's important, right? If you have a big that can run the court, you can play fast. And that's one thing I look at that there too. It would be a really fun series. Now, with Atlanta, what does this all mean for them, right? What does this mean entirely for them going forward, right? Well, I think it means that Nate McMillan is the man for the job for years to come. And I think Nate McMillan didn't deserve to be fired from Indiana, right? You've seen Indiana do a lot worse without him there. Because what Nate McMillan is really good at is having guys buy into playing together and playing really good defense, right? He's never had the most star talented teams. He's had teams, I think, that should have went far in the first round in the Eastern Conference. But he has a great ability to coach teams into playing good defense and to buying into each other. That's really good. He's a very good coach. He might not be like a top 10 coach in the NBA, but he is a very good coach. Like if you bring him to your culture, you know you're going to get winning from him. Like he's a very good coach. And that's the interesting thing about that. It's like when you look at him, I think he's an excellent coach that is underrated. People don't respect him enough just because he hasn't really produced as much in the playoffs. But his teams always get into playoff position and always have a good culture, good chemistry, and great defense. And that's an important point to just bring up for you guys. Now, the second thing to go is that proper motivation goes a long way, right? Trae Young has gotten more motivated to take care of the basketball, to play at a more mature pace, and it's paid off big time. You look at players like Bogdan Bogdanovic and Clint Capella, they played much better basketball because of the motivation of Nate McMillan and the structure of Nate McMillan. Defense and continuity matter in winning, right? That's my third point, right? Their defenses went up 3 spots in rating, and that's really important, right? You get better defensively, you have a better chance to win. And continuity, right? They're all passing the ball much better. More guys are getting touches. They play at a fast pace, and they move the ball really well. So that's important there too. And I think the important thing to make light of is that Atlanta is on the right path to achieving very good success. And that's because they've gotten good pieces. They have an excellent coach now. They have star players, right? But they have good free agent acquisitions that can be good complementary stars or role players in that spot too. And I look at all this and I say, this team is a team that can at least be in the playoffs every year and possibly be a second round or even contending team if they get more pieces, right? People like to go to teams that are young, exciting, fun to watch, and can bring some sort of level of competition successfully and can compete every year. So that's a point to make up for you guys as we go forward. We're going to take a quick commercial break here, but when I come back, we're going to talk about why super teams are bad for the NBA. All that coming back up, and I will see you guys shortly.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Michael Schroeder. And my last segment, if you guys didn't get a chance to check it out, was about the Atlanta Hawks and their success this season. And not necessarily throughout the entire season, it's been recently under new head coach Nate McMillan. And just showing again why Nate McMillan is an excellent coach and deserves to be recognized as that. Now, this segment I'm about to share with you guys is why I don't think super teams are good for the NBA, right? And this is not because of just what happened with the Brooklyn this year. It's a transpiring thing, right? It started, in, you can say, the creation of draft teams, creating super teams, but we're going to talk about specifically the Boston Celtics through the Brooklyn Nets, right? That period of time, because super teams started before the Boston Celtics, but I'm talking about like trading guys in to build super teams, right? You can look at the 80s Celtics and say that was a super team, but they did that mostly through the draft, right? They did the Robert Parrish trade, but they did it mostly through the draft, right? You can look at the super team in Houston, but that really didn't work out. A lot of those guys are older and they weren't really good and as they were in their prime, right? But nevertheless, I'm going to look at why super teams now are just a lot worse, right? And it's because of the buyout option, right? And it's different this year because the buyout option has allowed players just to walk away from teams as free agents, forfeit a portion of salary, and then they get paid a portion of their salary just to leave the team and go sign with someone else for a veterans minimum deal of like $1.5 million, and they can go join a contender, right? Before LaMarcus Aldridge retired, right? That's what he did. Andre Drummond does it with the Lakers. Blake Griffin did that with the Brooklyn Nets. And while I understand it's a rule and it's allowed, I think there's going to be a major pushback on buyouts because it really has resulted in, I think, bad competition angles in terms of basketball, right? A lot of these, players who were former All-Stars who still can play at a high level are now saying, oh, I want to go ring chase, and they go to the best team, right? It's just, and now you're building super teams and making the league kind of lopsided as opposed to this buyout market, right? And that's going to segue into my second point, and that is that competition now is lopsided, right? Brooklyn is clearly by far the most talented team, right, in the league, right? And you look at the Lakers, right, it was lopsided, right? When the Warriors got Kevin Durant, the West was lopsided, right? When you're a great player and you join a team full of great players, you ultimately make competition lopsided, right? People are like, oh, it's one player, he doesn't make a big difference. Yes, one player does make a big difference. It's because if you look at like Brooklyn, for example, right, before LaMarcus Aldridge retired, right, they had LaMarcus Aldridge who was averaging 13 points for them, right? Blake Griffin was averaging 8.6 points, but he's a guy that, still has a lot left in the tank. Then you have KD, Kyrie, and Harden, right? Harden, KD, and Kyrie all decide to play together, but Harden decides to just not give his best there in Houston, so he gets traded and goes to Brooklyn and plays in a super team. That's the problem there, right? The competition gets lopsided. You're just putting all the best players, and there's no room for real team rivalries, right? Which segues into another point I'm going to make is that there's less team rivalries now, right? Because all the players are moving around, right? You're making the competition lopsided. Wherever these players decide to go, that team ultimately becomes the favorite to win, and they're most likely going to, blow through everyone in the playoffs, and you're not really having rivalries between teams because it's just about, where do the players go, right? Now it's just become whoever versus LeBron James, right? It was Kawhi Leonard last year. It's been Kevin Durant most of the time. And it's not becoming a team thing. And I like team rivalries, right? I like those Knicks-Pacers battles back in the 90s, the Knicks-Bulls. I like the Bulls-Pistons in the 80s and 90s. I like the Celtics-Lakers, right? Those were real rivalries. Even just in the, you can even look at the Celtics and Lakers, even when the Big Three from Boston was created, right? It's very different, right? It's very different now because players are just basically leaving their teams, forcing their way out so they can go play with a contending team, right? Aaron Gordon did that with Orlando. And look, I get it. You want to win championships, right? And everyone has a niche that they want to go play and win championships. I get that. But there's a level of competition that needs to be recognized, right? Kevin Durant going to Golden State with that whole super team, you don't make there's no rivalry now. There's no rivalry between Golden State and the Clippers. There's no rivalry between Golden State and the Lakers anymore because what happened was He basically, and this is the point I'm going to make, he went from a team that just beat them in the Western Conference Finals, went and joined that team, and won 2 championships. A lot of older school players would never have done that. And that's where the team rivalries go out the window and the player rivalries start to get augmented, but not really in a very natural, fun way. It's more like people just don't like super teams, so they don't want to see them win. That's what happens ultimately at the end of the day, right? Every super team is created. Even LeBron James is guilty of this, right? LeBron James went to the Heat and joined up with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. But that was also a really, big three and they became the villains of the NBA. So don't forget that, right? The Warriors had Durant and Steph Curry, like with LeBron and D. Wade, who were 2 of the top 5 players in basketball. This team now with Brooklyn has 3 of arguably top 10 players in basketball, or even top 12, right? That's ridiculous, right? And that does lopsided competition, and that creates less team rivalries and more player rivalries, not because the player against each other, but it's more like fans have rivalries with these players because they don't want to see these teams win. And whether that's fair or not fair, that's how the reality, comes through. If you look at also another point I want to bring up is that there's no respect for the regular season now, right? Since you have a super team, you don't have to care about the regular season, right? Look at Golden State, look at the Clippers, look at this year's Brooklyn Nets. I'll give you a perfect recent example, right? The Sixers playing against the Brooklyn Nets. Kevin Durant was perfectly healthy enough to play, and the team rested him. He took a load management game off. If that was a chance, if the team really cared about the regular season, they would have played him, and I think they could have had a chance of winning that game. Really could have thought that, but they decided to play him against Minnesota, which is the worst team in the NBA, and they decided to play him against Charlotte, which is a team below 500 in the AC in the East, and completely confirming the problems of super teams all along. They don't care about the regular season. Kyrie Irving didn't play when the game got close in the fourth quarter against the 76ers. He's taken multiple days off because of personal reasons, right? And it's not just him, right? But look at the Clippers, right? Last year they load managed a lot of guys. The Warriors would a lot of times wouldn't even play their best at certain games, just lose teams that they didn't have to lose to. They would get the second or third seed, and they'd be like, we're good to go, no worries. This is a problem, right? And you look even like Blake Griffin, right? He's being preserved with load management when the guy's perfectly healthy and ready to go. He took 3 weeks off because he didn't play because of the buyout thing. And the problem is that people just coast through it, right? They just coast through the regular season. They don't care. And even with the Miami Heat, right, they didn't always care about the regular season so much. Even the Cavs, in a sense, right, they just didn't really care because they had LeBron James. They're we're good. But the problem is then it brings no value to the regular season. And like what I stated with the play-in tournament, there are teams that fight hard in the regular season to get their spot in the playoffs, right? It's a slap in the face to teams like Philly, who worked all year to get the number 1 seed, where they have not as much talent as Brooklyn, and they take the regular season much more seriously. And I think it's also something that's going to hurt these teams later on. And the reason why I say that is because if you're not building any sort of urgency and not caring about the regular season, not caring about building chemistry, and not caring about being reliable and taking things seriously, when you get a postseason thing, you don't have the chemistry built necessary to win a championship. That's a major problem. Major problem, right? And that's a big problem with these super teams, right? There's just no respect for the regular season anymore. And it's become in a sense that teams are just and analysts are just well, that team's going to be fine. They're just going to coast through the regular season and they'll figure it out later. They're talented enough, they'll figure it out. Here's the problem with that, right? We saw with the Clippers last year that doesn't always work, right? Because the issue with it, and the issue with this whole argument, and this is the problem I've seen exactly, is that you look at the regular season, right? You build chemistry through that. You build a continuity. You build a sense of a feel for the game, feel for how the NBA competition is going to be. If you just want to go in the playoffs and play, if you have no chemistry built, we saw with the Clippers last year, it backfires in your face big time, right? It does. And that's a big problem with them too. And I think just a big problem though, and is just, I think the real problem I have with super teams, to be frank, is just I like seeing competition. I like seeing multiple teams who have equal level stars being able to compete for a championship, right? That was what I liked to see when I was younger, before Miami created their big three, right? Like, I'll give you an example, right? In the Eastern Conference, right, you had LeBron with the Cavs, and you had the Boston team, which was a big three, right? But you also had Orlando and the Hawks and the Bulls, right? It was fun and was great to look at. Even the Detroit Pistons Bad Boy Part 2, right? What's interesting, though, is that like there's no competition really anymore, right? In the East, there's 3 teams that have clearly better super teams than everyone else, right? And it's just a competition thing, right? Like James Harden is teaming up with Kevin Durant and Kyrie, and they basically are just taking 3 of the best players, like, oh, let's just put them on a team, and then let's take, role players who are former All-NBA guys and put them on our team, and let's just, basically build a team that's unbeatable. Instead of actually, making a competitive league where there's 5 or 6 different teams that can win a championship, like in football, and that makes things a lot different. Because I like competition. I like seeing different drama and headlines because you have to beat everyone else, right? What I really liked about the early 2000s LeBron James is because he had to go through Detroit. He had to go through, Miami was pretty good at that time. Chicago was really good. Atlanta was still a good team. And then you had to go through Boston and Orlando. That was good. And in the Western Conference, right, you had Dallas, you had San Antonio, you had the Lakers, you had the Suns, you had the Utah Jazz. The Warriors weren't that bad either. The New Orleans Hornets weren't a bad team. They played at a high level too. The Rockets were good. There was multiple teams. Now, give me the teams in the Western Conference that are contenders, right? The Clippers, the Lakers, the Jazz, maybe the Suns, and Nuggets. There's 5 teams now. I just named 9 teams in the Western Conference that could compete for a championship back in the early 2000s. In the East, I just named about 6 teams, right? In the East now, we really say there's 3 teams, really 2, that can win a championship, right? And that's the problem with super teams. It's eliminated competition, right? It's eliminated it. And now teams have to build their team super team-wise and have to have 3 stars or 4 stars in order to win a championship, which is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It completely distorts competition. These young teams, it doesn't ever give a chance to look at these teams and see their growth. It discourages being loyal to a team. It discourages individualism and looking out for yourself rather than helping the team. And that's a problem, right? These guys are just chasing rings rather than actually helping their teams grow into a championship contender, right? It doesn't actually show me that a star player is a guy that a team can be built around, right? LeBron James has proven that because you can build around him and win a championship. And Luka Doncic has kind of proven that you can beat a playoff team by building around him. But ultimately, these super teams are not showing me that certain players are able to be built around to win a championship. And that's the big problem when I look at super teams ultimately at the end of the day, is that I don't really see, I don't really see a level of competition. And I also don't see any sort of loyalty. I don't see any sort of ability for players to look like that. Oh yeah, these guys can be built around with different pieces, right? There's not really as much of an emphasis of building through the draft anymore, right? Especially if you're a contending team, no one cares. And, it's a big deal to me, right? And the Lakers, for example, to compensate to all the stuff that Brooklyn did, they had to get Andre Drummond, right? Just put all the stars on all one team, right? Make the league, not competitive. But think about a team like Portland, a team that's not a super team, right? They got Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum who go out there and play every night, and they're loyal to their franchise, and they encourage competition. They play hard every single night. They're never going to win a championship in the next 5 years because every team in the West that's a contender or East that's a top team is just going to make a super team that's unbeatable, which is not fair for the league. It's not good for the league. And that's also the problem. And I think that something that also is interesting too is that, like I said before, the emphasis of not caring for the regular season. They're not caring about, oh yeah, we're preparing for the playoffs. No, we're preparing for the NBA Finals. So we don't need to take the regular season that seriously because we're just going to, show up to the postseason and run through everyone. That's a terrible mentality to have, and I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of these teams just putting it together 3 top 10 players in the NBA and saying, okay, compete with us. There's going to be great competition. No, it's not going to be great competition. If you have 3 top 10 players on a team, it's going to be really hard to beat them. The only reason why I said Philly can possibly beat Brooklyn is because Brooklyn hasn't developed the proper chemistry. But from a talent standpoint, not many teams stand a chance against Brooklyn because they have James Harden, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie Irving, 3 of the best ISO scorers I think we've ever seen. And 3 of the best players in the NBA, right? 3 of, you can arguably top 12 guys for sure. Kyrie might be a top 10 player at this point. But, and there's a point that I also just want to make too, right? What has captivated a lot of fans in the NBA circle is the fact of younger teams that have grown and become better, right? Everyone's captivated by like a Zion Williamson, right? Seeing the development of that Pelican team because they're exciting to watch. The captivation of a team like the Dallas Mavericks, right? They have 2 stars and they're young and they're evolving and getting better. What captivated people about like, Michael Jordan, right? Is that he kind of built. They got Scottie Pippen in the draft and that worked to win them winning a championship, right? The 80s Boston Celtics were a very similar way. Even though they were a super team, they did it through the draft, right? It's a very different thing. If you do it through the draft, there's no issue there. But if you're just like forcing your way out of your situation to go play with a championship team and, basically forego competition, you're number one foregoing competition, which is bad in itself. But you're also not highlighting all these great young teams who are building through the draft and trying to get a chance to win a championship, right? That's what Philly has done, right? Philly's become good by building through the draft, right? They got Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. And they got Tobias Harris in the trade, obviously, but that's the problem, right? I look at this and there's just major holes in this argument of super teams are good for the NBA. No, they're not. They're not. And also the fact that there's this buyout market. You don't have to give up big assets to get the super team, which I think is absurd because if you're going to get a star player, you should be able to have to give up a lot in return for him, right? That's how it works. But they don't have to do that anymore. And well, not necessarily a star player, but like a guy who was a star player that still can play at a high level, you can just buy him out and be like, yeah, you go and play, right? Andre Drummond's an all-star player for a couple of years in the NBA, right? He just said, we can't get any value for him, so we'll just buy him out. Lakers, you got him, right? Like that's ridiculous, right? You should work hard to try and get a trade with the guy instead of just letting him go to a contender and build another super team, and you have no chance at success in the future. It's just. This is why super teams are so bad for the NBA, and the stars, don't seem to care about the regular season, and it's bad, and it's a bad mentality to have. It's a bad concept to have, and that's the problem there too. Like, Michael Jordan when he didn't steal talent to become a great player and develop a good team. No. They got Scottie Pippen in the draft. They got Dennis Rodman, who was not a star player. He was a good defender. But they basically built to the draft. And they didn't have the most talented team, but they had Michael Jordan. And he said, I'm going to win with anyone. Like, I don't need to leave this team, right? And a lot of times with super teams, right? And this is like, I think the points I'm going to make about super teams are pretty easy, right? And I've made them across the segment, but I'm going to break them down very simply for you guys so you can leave with a message of why I don't like super teams, right? 1, there's no loyalty. 2, competition gets thrown out the window. 3, the teams don't care about the regular season. And 4, there's no team rivalries anymore, right? There's no and 5, there's no emphasis on young talents and the development through the draft. So the first thing is, right, there's no loyalty, right? You look at the Spurs, Kawhi Leonard goes to Toronto, wins a championship, right? Then he leaves and wants to create a super team in the Clippers, right? There's no loyalty. You look at LeBron James, right? He probably was a little too loyal to Cleveland, but the thing is, what's different about him is like you can say, oh, he wasn't loyal because he went to a big 3 in Miami. But he went back to Cleveland and helped that team win, right? You look at James Harden, right? A guy who was in Houston for years. Like, there's no loyalty there. He just went to Brooklyn to go win a championship. Blake Griffin, same thing. When these super teams are created, there's no loyalty. Competition gets thrown out the window because you're building these teams with, top 10, top 15 players. And if you have three of those guys, you take away the market of those other guys who could have went to other teams and developed them into championship-winning teams. And as a result of that, there's really only a couple teams that are going to win a championship each year. And those are the teams with the most talented teams and the super teams. And the third thing is that there's no respect for the regular season, right? Guys just load manage and take time off because they can, and they're saying, oh, it's no big deal, I'll just take time off, and I don't need to play because we'll just get ready for the NBA Finals. That's a major problem. The fourth thing is that there's no team rivalries anymore, right? There really isn't any team rivalries, right? It's player rivalries, player versus player, and the fans don't like the teams that are created the super team because they think that it's distorted competition. And the fifth thing is you don't see any young players, get to emerge in terms of championship contenders because even though they might build playoff teams and become all-stars, you don't see a team get developed through the draft as much because these super teams are just being created, which is one reason why the NBA was so fun to watch that process 10 years ago. And that's the problem with super teams now, right? People just, are done with competition and done with competing, and they just want to go compete by just joining a really good team with already established players, right? I get it sometimes comes down to style. I get it sometimes you want to learn how to win, right? But I think that you can develop through young players. Like, that's one reason I respect Giannis a lot is because Giannis is loyal to Milwaukee, right? He signed that huge extension. And Giannis has a lot of stuff he needs to improve to his game. He could have went to a Miami. He could have went to a Dallas. He could have went to a Golden State. He didn't do that, right? And I think that as a result of that, he's encouraging, hey, let's build through the draft. Let's build through, getting, key role players in free agency. I need to develop my game properly. That's the reason why Jordan was so regarded in a highlight as a basketball player, because he developed his game and they just got the necessary draft pieces and role player free agent guys to make that team good. They didn't have to build a super team to win, right? There were teams that are more talented than them, but they still won, right? Because they built the proper team. They didn't just take every talented player and put them on one team and say, okay, go win the championship, right? This is the problem with super teams, and this is why this whole thing about super teams is bad for the NBA, right? Repeat again, there's no loyalty from players. There's no sense of competition. Players and teams don't care about the regular season. There's no team rivalries built anymore, and you don't get to see teams build through their youth and build through the draft in order to become a championship-level team, right? It's only about the super teams that are going to win the championship. That's all it comes down to. And that's why super teams are bad for the NBA and are not good as these things continue to progress forward, right? It's going to really hurt the NBA more than help it, and that's my whole argument on why super teams are bad for the NBA. If you like the show, like our Facebook page. Also, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as subscribe to us on any podcast platform you listen to podcasts. We really would appreciate that. I'm Michael Schroeder, your host for this podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the...
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.